I wanted to continue our discussion of Seurat by spending a little bit of time going over the article by Linda Nochlin that you were supposed to have read for class last week, just to sort of talk about her ideas and how they affect our understanding and interpretation of the Grand Jatte. On the Norm, this painting is presented as an idealized and positive view of French society in the 19th century, showing it as a great harmonious melting pot. But Nochlin argues otherwise. And if we read it closely, we see that she's going to try to show us how, and here's a line from her, that it's not utopian at all, but rather is, in fact, exactly the opposite. And that for her, instead of, Seurat's picture reflecting the new society, she wants to argue that this painting is, in fact, producing meaning rather than simply passively reflecting it. And there's a quote on this on page 171. Seurat's painting should not be seen as only passively reflecting the new urban realities of the 1880s. Rather, the Grand Jatte must be seen as actively producing cultural meanings through the innovation of cultural codes for the modern experience of the city. And this leads her to basically stating her thesis at the bottom of 171 at the top of 172, where she says, of all of the post-impressionists, Seurat is the only one to inscribe the modern condition itself in the very fabric and structure of the picture. Now, what is this modern condition? She goes on to say it's alienation. Anomie. Anomie is another way of saying alienation, a lack of connection between people. It's the opposite of bonhomie, friendliness. The society of the spectacle, something we've read about before. Or living in a market economy in which mass production took the place of artisanal value. So she sees all of these things reflected in the picture, but at the same time the picture not only reflecting this, but constructing a comment on this issue, on urban alienation, on a lack of community, on the spectacle of modern Parisian living, on mass production replacing older artisanal ways of working. In order to analyze this, she has to go back and then talk about how utopia was defined in the 19th century. She does this over about 5 or 6 pages in the middle of the article. And she uses certain works as a way of emphasizing this. So for Nochlin, actually for the 19th century, based on 19th century sources, utopia was a place without a place. It was a perfect society that didn't exist in any given place. In fact, that's exactly what utopia means, no place. Since utopia is supposed to be in a placeless place, not a specific place, we often see them put into very idealized landscapes, evocative but not specific at all. Another aspect of the 19th century definition of utopia is that it is timeless, that time has no impact. And so in utopian pictures, we often see figures that are of roughly the same age. In this case we do have some young figures, but never much in the way of old figures. Granted, there's somebody in the middle here that is old. Sorry about that. That is old, but on the Norm, we have an old figure here, we have young figures here. But you can see that the majority of the figures here are, in fact, a sort of an ageless perfection, if you will. She mentions the term euchronos, as opposed to utopia, as a way of describing this. And these ageless perfect figures are usually shown in utopian pictures as having some descendants from Greco-Roman figures, which we talked about for Seurat as well when we looked at his works in the other screencast. The other thing that defines utopia, so there's lack of specific place, lack of time, lack of aging, if you will. But then the final thing is a sort of lack of any kind of social fragmentation or class distinctions. Everybody is together. That utopia is defined as a harmonious community, one where members of the community cooperate and interact. And Nochlin, in her article, points to paintings by Puvis de Chavannes, Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, as being works where we find these utopian ideals perhaps best illustrated. This pair of works at the National Gallery are smaller versions of murals that Puvis exhibited in the Salon of 1863. The original murals are 16, 17 feet across. Our pictures are smaller, still very large, about 5 feet across, but they're simply smaller versions of the same. And in each of them, we see these sort of perfect ideas of utopia: no place, no time, figures that work together, cooperate, interact, form a harmonious community that functions well together. This is how utopia was defined in the 19th century. And we need to know that before we go back and look at Seurat's picture. Now, it doesn't have to be a sort of allegorical picture with figures looking like they came out of Greek mythology in order to have a sort of utopian theme. Nochlin suggests that the paintings by Renoir present another great example of utopian paintings in the 19th century. The very famous Luncheon at the Boating Party over at the Phillips Collection, for example, perhaps their most famous picture. He does show a more particular time. It's a luncheon, after all, but he doesn't give it a particular day of the week. It could be any day. It could be a Tuesday. It could be a Sunday. It could be this year. It could be last year. It's not as specified as Seurat's picture is. It's also not a given place. There's no exact location that's been named here, and his painting, his composition is all but obscured any kind of identification of exactly where they are in this picture. But most importantly, it shows these people of Paris as a cooperative community. The elite, the boatmen that we read about when we talked about Caillebotte, mingling together over lunch in a way that is utterly cooperative, intimate, engaged with each other. Seurat's painting is none of the above. It really is the antithesis of all of this. This is why it's an anti-utopian allegory. Its title locks it into a very particular time and a very particular place, a Sunday afternoon, not just the afternoon, a Sunday afternoon, and where? On the island of the Grand Chat, a localizable place, a recognizable place. So that is anti-utopian in itself. Utopia is defined as something that's without a place, by definition. Utopia, no place. The figures that populate the Grand Chat don't cooperate at all. In fact, they rarely, if ever, have anything to do with each other. Even when they're seated next to each other, they look past each other. They may be seated in proximity, but they, as often as not, have nothing to do with each other. They don't represent a community. They're separated pockets of figures. Sometimes they're engaged with each other, but they're isolated from others around them. It's simply not a cohesive community. Even when they're standing together, they don't seem to be engaged with each other. This is most apparent in the foreground, which kind of sets the theme in a way. We have a group of three figures sitting, and these three figures not only have nothing to do with each other, but they also very much emphasize class distinction. Now, granted, Renoir had done that as well, but for Seurat, this seems to be much more of a prominent theme. Our fellow here in the tank top and his his little cap smoking on his pipe, seated directly next to two other people. None of them are looking at each other. This isn't a melting pot at all. They're all but ignoring each other here. Finally, again, there's a sense of time, a single place and a single moment in time. These people are all wearing the most up-to-date styles. Very conscious display of stylishness with many of the people, especially the pair coming in from the left. And you'll notice that even they don't seem to be all that engaged with each other, even though they're walking side by side. They're really there to strut their stuff, to show off the bustle and the new clothing that they have, their finery, their Sunday best. And yes, that is a pet monkey that she has on a leash. Here, again, adding to this idea of conscious display, of spectacle. So it's set in a particular time, it's set in a particular space. The figures don't represent a harmonious community. And then there's other things that sort of subvert the idea of utopia. The figure style that Seurat tends to use is, as we've looked at before, really dehumanized. It's so abstract, so impersonal in any possible way. And in discussing this, Nochlin turns to writings from this very period, the critiques of Seurat's work, that mentioned, for example, Febvre mentioned that Seurat depicted the, quote, rigidity of the Parisian lifestyle. Right? Adam wrote that the stiffness of these people show the reserve of our gestures and the British mode that we all imitate. Everybody's frozen. Paulet mentioned the automatic gestures of lead soldiers. Here's a pair that look almost like marionettes in the background that he's painted over the top of the water. You can still see the water kind of showing through their bodies. But Paulet mentioned that they're walking in a slow, banal, and identical step. So dehumanization is sort of the third part of our anti-utopian imagery as put forth by Seurat. The last element that Nochlin mentioned is his pointillism, the painting style through these tiny dots of color. That this too can be seen as a style, as carrying some meaning, as carrying or enhancing this anti-utopian theme that Seurat is developing throughout the entire work. Everywhere we look, it's monotonous. Dots, 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 dots. And he varies it a little bit, but not so much that it makes it as interesting as, say, a Monet work might be. It is mechanical. It's systematized. It's impersonal. Everywhere we look, it is exactly the same. It destroys individuality. And in fact, so many times in Seurat's painting, we see the faces all but disappear and fragment into these dots that supersede any sense of personality or individuality. This has been linked in many ways to modern publishing, where this dot matrix has moved to make up the reproduction of photographs in newspapers and whatnot. And Seurat is, again, very modern in this way. But mass production is, as Nochlin's thesis suggested, one of the things that he's addressing here, forming a statement about how that's replaced in many ways craftsmanship and handicraft. Now, this lifelessness that he depicts is obviously the result of a process of painting. Remember that Seurat's process was incredibly deliberate. He went from making sketches out of doors, which are significantly more vibrant. Look at the sailboat. That really does seem propelled by the breeze in the study on your right, compared to the sort of frozen arc of the sails on your left. Figures that seem to be doing things and moving in the study on your right, particularly the figure by the tree, knees up. Busy doing, whittling something maybe, it's hard to say for sure. but really actively doing things. This is frozen by the final work. The figure study here, the little girl next to her mother seems to be moving more. The two girls there seem less isolated, almost more conjoined. They're both looking in the same direction. The flowers that the girl on the right holds don't enwrap her attention so much that she ignores the people she's sitting next to. But any kind of vibrancy, any kind of life is more or less drained by the time you get to the final picture. As we get to the final study before the picture was completed, the final compositional picture, you can see that some of that life has begun to drain out of this. Things have become more rigid, more focused. But he's not done yet. It gets even more sort of frozen when we get to the final composition. And Nochlin summarizes this by looking at two different figures, comparing them between the Metropolitan Museum study on your right and the finished picture in Chicago on your left. One of the figures that she looks at is the figure of the wet nurse. We know she's the wet nurse based on the costume, that shawl that she wears straight down her back is in fact the costume of a wet nurse. But with her back to us, she no longer exists as someone who is associated with an activity. We don't know the activity. We only know the costume. She's become relegated to a symbol, a sign, a kind of icon, if you will, for her purpose in life rather than the purpose itself. This is easily the most abstract part of this composition, is the wet nurse, and the one that grabs the most attention, because unless you know your 19th century French costume and look at the studies that led to it, it ends up sitting there as this odd sort of ghost of something before it. And so Nochlin mentions how, as we look through the studies, he increasingly erases all evidence of her professional activity. She becomes nothing more than an emblem. Another figure that Nochlin focuses on as the antithesis of this is the figure in the background here. And if you look there, you can see there's the two details of her. The changes he's made as he's moved to the final version. He's removed some of the symbols of her action. The dog that she's playing with, I think, is still there, but has been moved deeper into the composition, and she's no longer playing with it. But Nochlin mentions that what Seurat really did was to make her more diagonal, more dynamic, more filled with movement, more contradictory to the other figures that we see. The other figures all get more frozen. She gets more active. Her dress flutters behind her more obviously. And Nochlin suggests that this is part of his overall composition, part of his overall idea. That whereas French society has frozen us as individuals, has ruined any sense of utopia, there is still hope with this little girl, symbol for the future, whose movement against the frozen nature of everything else can be seen as a sign that there is in fact hope for escape from this anti-utopian society. One other thing I might point to are the dogs in the foreground, because you guys know that I do like dogs a lot, and images of dogs. But it too is filled with motion, particularly that pug in the foreground, which is interestingly not there in the Met composition. It's a very late addition to the picture, almost like it's bounded in from his studio, if you will. It has a little ribbon that seems to suggest it belongs to a girl, but does it belong to the woman that we see with the buffalo on the right? And I don't think it does, because the monkey seems very much afraid of it. But it's skittering in, and it's about, again, to disrupt the utopia. It's moving toward that dog that is with that group of people, may belong to the man in the bowler hat, but again is disengaged from the group, as a group, sniffing at the woman's parasol. And our little pug is about to challenge it, to bound on up and try to play, moving into the composition in a way that the little girl moves out of the composition. And that he's going to jump in and engage suggests again this idea of hope, about something that might counter that overall sense of utopia. Although one could argue as well that maybe there's a lack of harmony here as well. Is he going to fight? Is that black dog going to kick the heck out of him once he gets there? Again, that's kind of hard to say. But he does seem to play as active a role as our little girl in the back. Finally, Machen concludes by connecting the dystopia of 19th century France that Seurat seems to be depicting, an anti-utopia, to the idea of spectacle, the urban spectacle that we read about in T.J. Clark, where, in fact, this conscious display of oneself in the city and the spectators of this display lie at the heart of many images by Seurat. And I think that in many ways with this composition, the couple at the right who's come in with her parasol, his cigar, his monocle no less, his spectacle, which you can see in this detail, they're surrogate spectators. They sort of tell us that this is really all about seeing and being seen. They are there to watch the other people, to look at them, around them, but they're also there to be seen. I mean, after all, that monkey, right? But also the flower in her hat. So spectatorship really lies at the heart of this anti-utopia that Seurat has depicted. And again, if we go back to what she said at the very beginning of the essay, this picture should not be seen as passively reflecting the new urban realities of the 1880s. Rather, the Grandchat must be seen as actively producing cultural meanings. He wants us to think about the world around us and imagine perhaps a way back to a utopia by showing us the anti-utopia as he sees it in France.